I'm Amber Hayes, 32, and I just discovered the most devastating betrayal of my life. For years, my parents claimed they couldn't afford to celebrate my birthdays while I watched friends enjoy parties I could only dream of. Yesterday, while organizing their papers after Dad's heart attack, I found rental agreements for our Vermont lake house, all dated during my birthday week spanning 20 years. The substantial deposits always made the day after my birthday tell a story my parents never wanted me to know. My entire childhood was built on a calculated lie. Before I dive into my story, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have celebrated you the most. Trust me, what I'm about to share might make you see your own childhood memories in a whole new light. The pattern started early. My 6th birthday was the first one I remember clearly. I'd been talking for weeks about wanting a small party with a princess cake and a few friends from school. Nothing extravagant, just a normal celebration like the ones I'd attended for classmates. The night before my birthday, I couldn't sleep from excitement. The next morning, Mom made pancakes, the only acknowledgement that the day was special. When I asked about the party, my father looked up from his newspaper with a stern expression. "Amber, we've talked about this. We can't afford a party this year. Be grateful for the pancakes your mother made." I remember my little heart sinking, but I nodded. Even at 6, I understood the concept of money being tight. I ate my pancakes in silence, trying not to show my disappointment. What confused me was that we didn't seem poor in other ways. Dad drove a nice car. We lived in a spacious home in a good neighborhood. We even had that beautiful lake house in Vermont that we visited several times a year, though never, I now realize, during my birthday week. My 7th birthday was almost identical. Again, I asked for a small celebration. Again, I was told we couldn't afford it. This time, my father added, maybe next year when things are better financially. But the next year wasn't better. Neither was the year after that or the one after that. By my 10th birthday, I had stopped asking altogether. The answer was always the same. "We can't afford it, Amber." My friend Megan Reynolds lived just down the street. Her parents weren't any wealthier than mine. Her dad was a teacher and her mom worked part-time at the library. Yet every year they threw Megan a party. Nothing extravagant, but always thoughtful, with cake and decorations, and a few friends gathered to celebrate her. After attending Megan's 9th birthday party, I came home full of stories about the scavenger hunt they'd organized throughout their backyard. Mom listened with a tight smile while preparing dinner. "That sounds lovely, sweetie, but you know the Reynolds probably put that on their credit card. Your father and I don't believe in going into debt for parties. It's not responsible." I learned not to compare. I learned that wanting to be celebrated was somehow selfish, financially irresponsible, a burden. The message was clear: I wasn't worth the expense. The summer I turned 10, I overheard a conversation that should have been my first clue. I was supposed to be swimming in our backyard pool, but I'd come inside for a towel when I heard my parents in the office. "The Henderson family wants to rent the lake house again this July," my father was saying. "They're offering $3,000 for the week." "That's during Amber's birthday," my mother replied, her voice hesitant. There was a pause before my father responded. "We weren't planning anything special. It's good money, Rachel. Better in our investment account than spent on a party she'll forget in a week." I froze in the hallway, the wet towel dripping onto the hardwood floor. $3,000. That was enough for 100 parties in my 10-year-old estimation. I didn't understand then why they would need that money so badly when we seemed comfortable in every other way. By the time I turned 13, I had internalized the message completely. I no longer mentioned my birthday as it approached. I accepted the pancake breakfast and small gift, usually something practical like clothes or school supplies, with genuine gratitude. I believed we truly couldn't afford anything more. This pattern shaped me in ways I didn't recognize until much later. I became hyper-conscious about money, never asking for anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I started babysitting at 12, earlier than most of my friends, and saved every dollar. I worked through high school and took on extra shifts whenever possible. In college, I applied for every scholarship available and worked 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA. My friends called me driven. My professors called me dedicated. Looking back now, I recognize it for what it truly was. I was trying to prove my worth through achievement, since I hadn't been deemed worthy of celebration. By the time I graduated college with honors debt-free through my own efforts, I had completely normalized the idea that spending money on myself was unnecessary, even selfish. I learned to diminish my own needs to require so little that no one would ever have to say to me again, "We can't afford it, Amber." It would take 20 more years before I discovered the truth behind those words. My father's heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in April. I was in the middle of a client presentation when my phone lit up with my sister's name. Stephanie never called during work hours, so I knew immediately something was wrong. 3 hours later, I was on a flight back to my hometown, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Dad survived, but the scare was significant enough that my mother asked me to stay for a few weeks to help organize their affairs just in case. That's how I found myself sitting at the desk in my father's home office, sorting through decades of financial documents while he recovered in the bedroom down the hall. The lake house had always been my father's pride and joy. A beautiful 3-bedroom property on Lake Champlain with a private dock and stunning views of the mountains. It had been in our family since before I was born, inherited from my father's parents. Growing up, we spent several weekends there each year, but always with the understanding that it was a special privilege, not something we could afford to maintain without careful financial planning. I was organizing property tax records when I found the first rental agreement dated 22 years earlier, the week of my 10th birthday. The Henderson family, 2 parents and their son, had paid $3,000 for a 7-day stay. Just as I'd overheard all those years ago, my hands trembled slightly as I continued looking through the files. There were more agreements, all neatly organized by year, all spanning the same week in July, my birthday week. Year after year, different families had rented our lake house during that specific time. The amounts increased over time, from $3,000 in the earliest years to nearly $7,000 in the most recent contracts. With a growing sense of disbelief, I calculated the total. Over 22 years, my parents had earned well over $100,000 renting out the lake house during my birthday weeks. The financial records weren't the only thing in those files. There were photos, 2 professional ones taken to advertise the property on rental sites, but also candid shots sent by grateful renters. Families celebrating on the dock. Children having water balloon fights on the lawn. A teenage boy blowing out candles on a birthday cake, the lake sparkling in the background behind him. Birthday celebrations. At our lake house, during my birthday week, I sat back in my father's leather chair, my breath coming in short gasps as the implications hit me. They hadn't been unable to afford celebrating my birthday. They had actively chosen to profit from that time instead. My birthday hadn't been a financial burden they couldn't bear. It had been a lucrative opportunity they hadn't wanted to miss. The door to the office opened and my mother stepped in with a cup of tea. "How's it going in here? Finding everything okay?" she asked, setting the mug on the desk. I looked up at her, this woman who had comforted me through childhood disappointments, who had wiped my tears on so many birthday mornings when I tried to hide my hurt about another year without celebration. "Mom," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "What are these?" I gestured to the pile of rental agreements spread across the desk. She glanced at them and I saw the exact moment recognition dawned in her eyes. Her face paled and she reached for the edge of the desk to steady herself. "Those are just. Your father handles all the financial aspects of the lake house," she said, her voice thin. "These are all during my birthday week. Every single year. Amber, you know, we've always had to be careful with money. Careful enough to earn over $100,000 renting out our lake house during my birthdays, while telling me we couldn't afford a simple party." My voice cracked on the last word. My mother looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "Your father made those decisions. It was always about the long-term financial security of this family. It was the non-answer of someone who knew there was no justification. I stood up, gathering the rental agreements into a folder. "I need some time to process this," I said, walking past her toward the door. "Amber, wait," she called, but I was already halfway down the hallway, my mind racing with questions. If this had been happening all along, what else had I been lied to about? How deep did this betrayal go? I needed answers, and I knew there had to be more to find. I didn't confront my father that day. He was still recovering, and despite my anger, I couldn't bring myself to risk his health with a confrontation. Instead, I decided to dig deeper to understand the full scope of what had been happening throughout my childhood. Little did I know the rental agreements were just the beginning. The next morning, I returned to my father's office with renewed determination. If they had lied about the lake house rentals, what else might I discover? I began methodically going through every cabinet and drawer, no longer just organizing but searching for answers. In the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet behind tax returns from the early 2000s, I found a box labeled Stephanie. Special occasions. My sister is 3 years younger than me, and we've always been close despite the typical sibling rivalries of childhood. With a feeling of trepidation, I opened the box. Inside were photo albums, receipts, and handwritten notes detailing every birthday celebration Stephanie had ever had. Her 8th birthday at the local roller skating rink with a professional photographer and custom cake. Her 12th birthday, a sleepover for 10 girls with catered food and hired entertainment. Her 16th, a surprise party at an upscale restaurant followed by a weekend trip to New York City. The receipts were all there, meticulously organized and preserved. $500 for the roller rink rental, $800 for the photographer, $1,200 for the restaurant. Nearly $3,000 for the New York trip. I felt dizzy as I flipped through the photos. There was Stephanie beaming in front of a lavish cake surrounded by friends. There were my parents smiling proudly beside her. In some photos I could even see myself in the background, clearly part of the celebration, but somehow separate the expression on my younger face, a mixture of happiness for my sister and confusion that I now recognized as the cognitive dissonance of a child trying to understand inconsistent treatment. What struck me most was the timing. Stephanie's 16th birthday celebration had cost nearly $3,000, the exact amount the lake house had been rented for during my 16th birthday the year before. I was still sitting on the floor surrounded by these records when Stephanie arrived. She'd driven up from her apartment in Boston after her morning class to check on Dad. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. I looked up, tears blurring my vision. "Did you know?" What she stepped into the room, concern crossing her face as she saw the state I was in. "That they celebrated every single one of your birthdays while telling me they couldn't afford to celebrate mine." I gestured to the box between us. Stephanie's face went through a series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, then dawning horror. She knelt beside me, picking up one of the photo albums. "Amber, I didn't realize." She flipped through the pages, then looked back at me. "They always told me you didn't like big celebrations, that you preferred quiet birthdays." I laughed bitterly. "They told me we couldn't afford parties every single year, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would they?" "Because they were renting out the lake house during my birthday week every year," I said, handing her the folder of rental agreements. "Making thousands of dollars instead of spending a few hundred on their firstborn daughter." Stephanie's hands trembled as she compared the dates on the rental agreements with the receipts from her own celebrations. "Oh my God, Amber. I had no idea. I swear I didn't know." And looking at my sister's devastated face, I believed her. Stephanie had been as much a pawn in this situation as I had been. The difference was that she had been given the gift of celebration, of feeling valued and worthy of expense and effort. I had been given the opposite message so consistently and for so many years that it had shaped my entire relationship with self-worth. "There's more," I said, pulling out a particularly painful piece of evidence. It was a receipt for Stephanie's 13th birthday party dated the same week as my 16th. They threw you a party the same week they told me we couldn't afford one for my sweet 16. Stephanie put her hand to her mouth. I remember that. You helped decorate for my party. You seemed so happy to do it. I never questioned why you didn't have one of your own. The memory came rushing back, standing on a chair hanging streamers for my little sister's celebration, pushing down my own disappointment, telling myself that Stephanie deserved this happiness even if I somehow didn't. They made me complicit in my own exclusion, I whispered. And they made you complicit too, without either of us realizing it. Stephanie moved the box aside and wrapped her arms around me. I'm so sorry, Amber. I never would have accepted those parties if I'd known. As we sat there on the office floor, surrounded by evidence of such different childhoods within the same family, a terrible question began forming in my mind. Why? What could possibly explain such drastically different treatment of two sisters by the same parents? The answer I suspected would be even more painful than what I'd discovered so far. And I was right. The next few days passed in a blur of discoveries as I continued my investigation into our family's past. Stephanie had returned to Boston for an important exam but promised to come back the following weekend. She was texting me constantly, processing her own shock and guilt about our disparate childhoods. In my parents' bedroom closet behind my mother's winter clothes, I found a stack of old journals. I knew reading them was an invasion of privacy, but at this point I felt entitled to answers. The journals dated back to before I was born, chronicling my mother's pregnancy and early years of parenthood. The entries from when she was pregnant with me were illuminating. William is so certain it's a boy. He's already talking about teaching him to fish at the lake house, coaching his little league team. I don't have the heart to tell him I think it's a girl. The doctor says we could find out, but William wants to be surprised. And then after my birth, William tried to hide his disappointment when the doctor said it's a girl, but I could see it in his eyes. He rallied quickly, held Amber, and said she was beautiful, but later at home he confessed he'd been so sure he was getting a son. We'll try again, I told him. Next time. The journals painted a picture of a man deeply invested in traditional gender roles and family structures. My father had wanted a son to carry on the Hayes name, to follow in his footsteps, to be the heir to his self-made success. Instead, he got me a daughter who, no matter how hard she tried, could never be the son he'd wanted. More entries followed as I grew older. Amber tried so hard to interest William in her drawings today. He barely looked up from his newspaper. Later he spent an hour teaching the neighbor's boy how to throw a baseball. Sometimes I don't understand him. She's trying so hard to please him. When my sister was born, another girl, the entries suggested my father had given up on having a son, but somehow blamed me for the initial disappointment. William seems to have made peace with having daughters. He dotes on Stephanie in a way he never did with Amber. Maybe his expectations were too high the first time around, or maybe Stephanie just naturally fits better with what he wanted. I wish I could get him to see how special Amber is too. I found letters as well exchanged between my parents and relatives. One from my father's brother Robert was particularly revealing. Bill, you need to get over this fixation on having a son. Amber is a bright kid and she's trying her hardest to get your attention. Stephanie too. Count your blessings instead of dwelling on what you don't have. My father's unsent reply drafted on his computer and printed but never mailed. You don't understand, Rob. It's not about not appreciating my daughters, it's about legacy. Who will carry on the Hayes name? Who will take over the business I've built? Girls marry and take their husbands' names. They build their husbands' legacies, not their fathers'. That's just the reality. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. My father's disappointment had morphed into a pattern of emotional withholding. Stephanie, coming later, had been spared the worst of his disillusionment, but I had borne the brunt of it year after year, birthday after birthday. Most damning of all were the rental records themselves. Looking more carefully at the names, I realized something I'd missed initially. Almost all of the families who rented our lake house during my birthday weeks had sons around my age. In the photos they'd sent, boys were swimming from our dock, fishing from our rowboat, celebrating in spaces that had been denied to me. My father had been renting our lake house to families with the sons he wished he'd had instead of me. The realization sent me spiraling back through memories of trying to connect with my father, the science project I'd worked on for weeks that he'd barely acknowledged. The time I'd caught a fish at the lake and his lukewarm good job compared to his enthusiastic response when the neighbor's son caught one half the size. The way I'd eventually stopped bringing home my academic achievements because his response was always the same. A nod, maybe, that's nice, and a quick return to whatever he'd been doing. I'd responded by becoming the perfect daughter. Straight A's throughout school, class president, valedictorian, a prestigious college scholarship, a successful career, all in a desperate unconscious attempt to prove my worth to a man who had decided before I was even born that I was a disappointment. My mother had been complicit in her silence, going along with my father's decisions even while occasionally trying to soften their impact. Her journals revealed a woman who recognized the unfairness but lacked the courage to challenge her husband directly. The following weekend I drove to my Aunt Jessica's house. As my mother's sister, she'd been a peripheral presence in our lives, invited to major holidays but never quite part of the inner circle. I'd always sensed my father didn't approve of her independent lifestyle. Aunt Jessica welcomed me with a hug and a knowing look. "You've finally figured it out, haven't you?" Over tea at her kitchen table, she filled in more of the family history. My mother had grown up in a household where her own father ruled with an iron fist. Financial control had been his primary tool, doling out money as reward, withholding it as punishment. "Your mother recreated her childhood by marrying your father," Jessica explained. "William controlled the finances completely. Rachel didn't even have her own bank account until 10 years into their marriage. She was given an allowance like a child. But why didn't she stand up for me, for my birthdays at least?" Jessica sighed. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Amber, and patterns are hard to break. Your mother saw how her own mother was treated when she challenged your grandfather. I'm not excusing her behavior, just trying to help you understand it." As I drove home from Aunt Jessica's, pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The denial of celebration hadn't been about money at all. It had been about value, about worth, about a father's disappointment and a mother's fear, about a family dynamic built on unspoken resentments and expectations that no child should ever have to bear. The time had come for a confrontation. I could no longer pretend I didn't know the truth. 26 years of birthdays had been sacrificed on the altar of my father's disappointment, and I deserved answers not just for my own healing, but for the truth to finally be spoken aloud in a family that had survived on silence for far too long. I spent the next week gathering everything I'd discovered: financial records, journals, letters, photos, and organizing them chronologically. I created a timeline showing the pattern of lake house rentals alongside my birthdays and Stephanie's celebrations. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to explain away. Stephanie drove up from Boston on Friday evening. We stayed up late in my childhood bedroom, finalizing our approach for the confrontation we'd planned for the following day. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Stephanie asked, concern etched on her face. "Dad's still recovering. The doctor said he's stable," I replied. "And I can't keep pretending. This has shaped my entire life, Steph. I need to understand why." The next morning I asked my mother to prepare a family dinner. "I'd like us all to talk," I said, my tone making it clear this wasn't a casual request. My mother looked nervous but nodded. "I'll make lasagna, your father's favorite." The hours crawling toward dinner were some of the longest of my life. Stephanie and I took a walk around the neighborhood, past Megan Reynolds' old house, past the park where other children had had birthday parties, while I watched from the sidelines. "I never realized how different our childhoods were," Stephanie said quietly. How did I not see it? We don't question the worlds we grow up in, I replied. They're just normal to us until something forces us to see otherwise. By 6 o'clock we were all seated around the dining room table, my father at the head looking much improved though still pale, my mother to his right hands fidgeting with her napkin. Stephanie and I side by side opposite her. I waited until we'd all been served before placing a folder on the table beside my plate. I've been organizing your financial records. I began, my voice steadier than I expected, and I found some interesting patterns. My father nodded. Good. It's important to keep thorough records. Your mother never had a head for finances. I noticed especially thorough records regarding the lake house rentals. I continued opening the folder and sliding out the first set of documents, particularly during the second week of July. Every year, for the past 26 years, my father's expression didn't change, but a slight tensing around his eyes told me he understood exactly what I was saying. Rental income is an important part of maintaining a vacation property, he replied smoothly. The lake house has always been a financial investment as much as a family retreat. An investment that coincidentally was only rented during my birthday week. Never during Stephanie's quotee. My mother was staring at her plate, refusing to look up. Stephanie reached under the table and squeezed my hand in solidarity. It was the most lucrative week, my father said dismissively. Summer peak season. I pulled out the next set of documents. And these receipts showing thousands spent on Stephanie's birthday celebrations during the same years you told me we couldn't afford a simple party for mine. Was that also about lucrative timing? For the first time, my father looked uncomfortable. My mother made a small sound almost like a whimper. We made different parenting decisions based on individual circumstances, my father said, his tone hardening. Financial situations change over time. No, they don't change that consistently, that predictably, always disadvantaging the same child. I laid out the timeline I'd created. The same week you told 13-year-old me we couldn't afford a $50 skating party, you spent $500 on Stephanie's birthday and made $3,000 renting out the lake house. Amber, my mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. It wasn't like that. There were considerations you don't understand. Then help me understand, I interrupted. Help me understand why every single one of my birthdays was deemed unworthy of celebration, while every single one of Stephanie's was marked with parties and presents and photos. My father's face was flushing with anger. We provided you with everything you needed: food, clothing, education. Birthday parties are frivolous expenses, except when they were for Stephanie. I turned to my sister. I don't blame you. You didn't know. I didn't, she confirmed, looking directly at our parents. Why would you do this? How could you treat Amber so differently? The silence stretched, my father's jaw working, as he struggled to maintain control of a conversation that was rapidly slipping away from him. Finally, I pulled out the journal entries. I think I know why, I said quietly. You wanted a son, my mother gasped. Amber, those journals are private. And my birthdays should have been celebrated, I countered. We all made sacrifices, it seems. My father pushed back from the table, his face now crimson. This is ridiculous. You're behaving like a child, digging through our personal records, making accusations. I'm behaving like someone who just discovered her entire childhood was built on lies, I said, my voice rising to match his. You rented our lake house to families with sons, while telling me you couldn't afford to celebrate my birthday. What was that about, Dad? Were you punishing me for not being the boy you wanted? We needed the money for investments that mattered, he snapped, finally losing his composure. Not wasting it on parties and cake. The room went silent. My mother covered her face with her hands. Investments that mattered, I repeated slowly, but I didn't matter enough. My father seemed to realize what he'd revealed. He backpedaled quickly. That's not what I meant. We were saving for your future for college. I paid for college myself, I reminded him. With scholarships and jobs. The money you saved by not celebrating me, where did that go? My mother spoke up, her voice barely audible. We put it toward retirement. Your father wanted to make sure we would never be a burden to you girls. So you burdened me with the belief that I wasn't worth celebrating instead. I felt tears threatening but forced them back. Do you have any idea what that did to me, how it shaped me? You turned out fine, my father said dismissively. Better than fine. You're successful, independent. Stronger than you would have been if we'd spoiled you with parties and presents. That's not for you to decide, Stephanie interjected. You don't get to experiment with one child's emotional well-being while indulging the other. My father turned to her with surprise, unused to hearing opposition from his younger daughter. Taking advantage of his momentary silence, I asked the question that had been haunting me since I'd found the rental records. Did you ever think I would amount to anything? Dad, was I ever anything but a disappointment from the moment the doctor said, "It's a girl"? His hesitation told me everything. After a long moment he sighed. I had different expectations, different hopes. I adjusted, by punishing me for not being the son you wanted, by preparing you for a world that's harder on women, he countered, by making you resilient. No, my mother suddenly said, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. William, that's not true and you know it. You were harder on Amber because you were disappointed. I went along with it because I was afraid to challenge you, and that's my failure as a mother. But I won't let you rewrite history now. My father stared at her as if he'd never seen her before. In 26 years I'd never heard my mother directly contradict him. We prioritized our retirement over celebrating Amber, she continued, tears streaming down her face. We told ourselves it was responsible parenting, but it wasn't. It was selfish and cruel, and I've regretted it every year. The admission hung in the air between us, the truth finally spoken aloud after decades of silence. My father's face had gone from red to pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I think I've lost my appetite, he said, finally standing up. This conversation is over. No, I said, also rising. It's just beginning. For 26 years you've controlled this family's narrative. That ends today. He walked out without another word, leaving the three of us at the table surrounded by evidence of a family built on inequity and unspoken resentment. But for the first time I felt something other than hurt and confusion. I felt vindicated. And I felt free. The fallout from our confrontation was immediate and divisive. By Sunday morning my father had called his brother Robert, who arrived at the house by noon with his wife in tow. Uncle Robert had always been my father's staunchest defender, quick to praise his business acumen and traditional values. You've gone too far, Amber, Uncle Robert said when he cornered me in the kitchen. Digging through your parents' private papers while your father is recovering from a heart attack. What were you thinking? I was thinking I deserved the truth after 26 years of lies, I replied calmly. Would you like to see the evidence yourself? Your father has always provided for this family, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. He put a roof over your head, food on the table. Many children have it much worse. Material provision doesn't excuse emotional neglect, I countered. And selective celebration of one child over another is a form of emotional abuse. That word, abuse, hung in the air between us. Uncle Robert's face flushed with anger. You ungrateful, he started, but Aunt Patricia laid a restraining hand on his arm. Robert, she said quietly, let's not make this worse. I left them in the kitchen and retreated to my father's office, where I'd been continuing my investigation into the family finances. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with text messages from cousins who had apparently heard about the confrontation. My father's side of the family closed ranks around him predictably. Cousin Jennifer wrote, Grandpa always said you were the difficult one. Guess he was right. Cousin Michael, family business should stay private. You're just causing drama. But my mother's side of the family had a different reaction. Aunt Jessica called me directly. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, she said. It's about time someone called William out on his behavior. By Monday, the battle lines were clearly drawn. My father had retreated to his home office, refusing to speak to me directly. He communicated through my mother, who looked increasingly torn between loyalty to her husband and her growing recognition of the harm they'd caused me. Stephanie had returned to Boston for classes, but called me several times a day for updates. "I've been thinking about all this," she said during one call. "I'm going to pay you back." "Pay me back for what?" "For all my birthdays." I calculated it about $20,000 over the years. It should have been split equally between us. I was touched by the gesture but declined. "This isn't about money, Steph. It's about recognition, acknowledgement. I don't want their money or yours. I want the truth to be known." On Tuesday afternoon, my mother found me in the garden where I'd gone to escape the tension in the house. She sat beside me on the stone bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I have something to show you," she said, holding out a small key. "It opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank, box 247. I took the key, confused. "What's in it?" "Money," she admitted. "I've been putting aside small amounts for years. From my teaching salary, from household money I managed to save. It's not much, but it was supposed to be for you." "You've been saving money for me in secret?" I asked, stunned. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I knew what your father was doing wasn't right. I was too weak to confront him directly, but I thought someday I could make it up to you somehow." The revelation added another complex layer to my understanding of my mother. Not just a passive participant in my father's emotional neglect, but someone who had recognized the wrong and tried in her limited way to mitigate it. "Why are you giving me this now?" I asked. "Because I'm tired of secrets," she replied simply. "And because I'm sorry, Amber. So deeply sorry." The next day I visited the bank and opened the safe deposit box. Inside was nearly $30,000 in cash, along with a letter from my mother expressing her regret for not being stronger, for not protecting me from my father's disappointment. She had been saving since I was 10 years old, putting aside what money she could without my father's knowledge. Meanwhile, my father had been rallying support from his side of the family and business associates. I began hearing from extended family members. I rarely spoke to all with the same message: I was being unreasonable, dredging up the past, making a mountain out of a molehill. My father had apparently framed the situation as me being resentful about money, conveniently omitting the emotional context of his decades-long pattern of favoritism. My cousin David called me directly. "Uncle Bill says you're demanding back pay for birthday parties," he said, sounding confused. "That doesn't sound like you." "That's not what this is about at all," I explained, then told him the full story. By the end, he was silent. "Wow," he finally said. "I had no idea. That's messed up, Amber." "Tell that to your father," I replied. David was Uncle Robert's son and had always been close to my father. "I will," he promised. "And I'll talk to the others too. This isn't right." Unexpectedly, I found an ally in Thomas Bennett, my father's longtime business partner. He came to the house on Thursday evening asking to speak with me privately. "Your father and I have been friends for 30 years, he began as we sat in the backyard. "I've watched you grow up, seen how hard you've worked, how much you've accomplished." I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. "William is a complicated man," Thomas continued. "Brilliant in business, loyal as a friend, but he hesitated. He has blind spots, particularly when it comes to gender." "That's a generous way of putting it," I said dryly. Thomas smiled sadly. "I confronted him once years ago about how differently he treated you and Stephanie. It was after your high school graduation. You were valedictorian, had that full scholarship to Princeton. Most parents would have been bursting with pride." "I remember," I said quietly. He said, "Good job," and then spent the evening talking to Uncle Robert about golf. "Yes." I took him aside later and asked what it would take for him to show genuine pride in your accomplishments. Do you know what he said? I shook my head. He said, "Amber doesn't need my praise. She's self-sufficient. That's what I raised her to be." As if emotional withholding was some kind of gift he'd given you. The words stung, but they also clarified something I'd always sensed but never fully understood. My father's emotional distance had been deliberate, a parenting strategy he'd convinced himself was for my benefit. "I'm telling you this not to excuse his behavior," Thomas continued, "but to help you understand it, and to let you know that not everyone in his circle agrees with him. Some of us saw what was happening and should have spoken up more forcefully." As the week progressed, I was surprised to discover how many people had witnessed my childhood exclusion without fully registering its significance. My elementary school teacher, Mrs. Lawrence, whom I ran into at the grocery store, mentioned that she had always wondered why I never had birthday invitations to distribute to classmates when other children regularly did. "I even called your mother once," she admitted. "She said your family preferred private celebrations." I sensed something wasn't quite right, but in those days we were less inclined to question parents' decisions. By Friday, the family had clearly divided into factions. My father remained in his home office, emerging only for meals which he ate in stony silence. My mother moved between us like a ghost, apologizing to me in private while attempting to placate him in public. Stephanie returned from Boston for the weekend, bringing with her the protective fierceness of a sister who had discovered an imbalance she'd benefited from, unwittingly. The most surprising development came when I checked the vacation rental platform where my parents listed the lake house. There in the reviews section were years of comments from families who had rented during my birthday weeks. "Perfect celebration spot for our son's 13th birthday. Our boy loved fishing from the dock for his special day. Best Sweet 16 venue for our son. He and his friends had a blast." Reading these reviews, seeing how our family property had been used to create joyful memories for other children while I was denied, the same crystallized my resolve. This confrontation wasn't just about healing my past wounds. It was about bringing truth to light in a family that had subsisted on lies for far too long. With the evidence gathered, allies secured, and battle lines drawn, I prepared for the next phase of this family reckoning, one that would require legal expertise and a willingness to challenge not just emotional patterns but financial ones as well. The emotional toll of my discoveries became impossible to ignore in the weeks that followed. While continuing to stay at my parents' house, partly to support my father's recovery, partly to complete my investigation, I found myself struggling with insomnia and unexpected emotional outbursts. Small triggers would set off disproportionate responses, finding a childhood photo where I was smiling bravely through another celebrationless birthday. Discovering old thank you notes I'd written for practical gifts while Stephanie received things she'd actually wanted. After a particularly difficult night where I found myself sobbing at 3 a.m. over a box of my school achievements that had never been properly acknowledged, I knew I needed professional help to process what I was experiencing. Through a recommendation from Aunt Jessica, I made an appointment with Dr. Karen Sullivan, a therapist specializing in family trauma. Dr. Sullivan's office was a calm, neutral space that immediately put me at ease. In our first session, I poured out the entire story. The lake house rentals, the birthdays never celebrated, the evidence of long-term emotional neglect. "What you're describing is a form of differential treatment that can be deeply damaging to a child's sense of self-worth," Dr. Sullivan explained after listening attentively. "Children are remarkably perceptive. They notice patterns of inequality within families, even when they can't articulate what they're experiencing." I always knew something was wrong, I admitted, but I blamed myself. I thought if I just achieved more, behaved better, needed less, then maybe I'd be worth celebrating too. "That's a common response," she nodded. "Children tend to internalize family dynamics, assuming that if they're treated differently, it must be because of some inherent flaw in themselves." Over the next several sessions, Dr. Sullivan helped me identify how this childhood dynamic had shaped my adult personality and relationships. My perfectionism, my difficulty accepting praise, my tendency to minimize my own needs while overextending myself for others, all could be traced back to those formative experiences of being deemed less worthy of celebration than my sister. You developed a success-based identity, she explained in our fourth session. Because your intrinsic worth wasn't affirmed, you came to believe that your value was tied exclusively to your achievements. That's why you're so driven professionally but struggle with allowing yourself simple pleasures or celebrations. This insight illuminated patterns I'd never fully understood. Why I'd work through holidays and weekends while colleagues took well-deserved breaks. Why I'd never thrown myself a birthday party even as an adult with my own money. Why I'd ended relationships with men who wanted to celebrate me finding their attention somehow suspicious or undeserved. And my romantic relationships I ventured in our fifth session. I've always chosen men who are emotionally unavailable or who prioritize their needs over mine. You're recreating the dynamic you had with your father, Dr. Sullivan confirmed. It's familiar territory even if it's painful. We often unconsciously seek to resolve childhood wounds through our adult relationships. As illuminating as therapy was, real-world triggers continued to challenge my progress. One Saturday afternoon, I attended the birthday party of my friend Megan's 5-year-old daughter. Watching the child's face light up as she opened presents surrounded by family who clearly delighted in celebrating her, I felt a wave of grief so intense, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom where I sat on the closed toilet lid and sobbed silently for 10 minutes. When I returned, Megan noticed my reddened eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly while the children played a game in the next room. "Just processing some stuff from childhood," I replied, trying to downplay my reaction. Megan, who knew some but not all of what I'd discovered, squeezed my hand. "Whatever happened, Amber, it wasn't because you weren't worth celebrating. I hope you know that." Her words, simple but sincere, punctured something in me, a lingering doubt that perhaps my parents had been right, that perhaps I really hadn't been deserving of celebration. The fact that others could see my worth so clearly when my own father couldn't was both healing and heartbreaking. In my next session with Dr. Sullivan, I explored this contradiction. Why can friends and colleagues see value in me that my own father couldn't? What was so fundamentally disappointing about me to him? "This isn't about any actual deficit in you," Amber, Dr. Sullivan emphasized. "Your father's inability to celebrate you reflects his limitations, not yours. He was operating from a rigid expectation based on gender and legacy that had nothing to do with your actual worth as a person." Intellectually, I understood this. But emotionally, the child in me still craved that validation, that acknowledgement that I had been worthy all along. The hardest part, I confessed, is knowing that he celebrated Stephanie. It wasn't that he couldn't celebrate a child, just that he couldn't celebrate me. Differential treatment between siblings is particularly damaging, Dr. Sullivan agreed. It creates a false narrative that one child is more deserving of love and attention than another, when in reality it's about the parents' issues, not the children's worthiness. As weeks passed, our sessions helped me develop a framework for understanding my experiences without being defined by them. I began to recognize the strengths I developed despite, or perhaps because of my upbringing: resilience, self-sufficiency, empathy for others who felt excluded or undervalued. "You've built an impressive life," Dr. Sullivan noted in our 10th session. "Professional success, meaningful friendships, the courage to confront painful truths. Those achievements are yours, not compensatory behaviors for a childhood deficit. The challenge now is to integrate this new understanding of your past with a future where you allow yourself to be celebrated, to take up space, to know your intrinsic worth apart from what you accomplish." This process of integration wasn't linear. There were setbacks, like when I discovered additional photos of families celebrating at our lake house during my birthday weeks, one showing a boy's 16th birthday party with a banner hung on the same deck where I'd spent summers reading alone, invisible to my father despite my accomplishments. But there were breakthroughs too. With Dr. Sullivan's encouragement, I began allowing friends to celebrate my achievements, a promotion at work, the publication of an article I'd written. I started saying yes when people offered help instead of insisting I could manage alone. Small steps toward accepting that I was worthy of attention and care, not despite needing it but because all humans do. The true test came when Megan's daughter made me a handmade birthday card weeks before my actual birthday. "So you have time to plan your party," she explained, her small face serious. "Mommy says everyone deserves a special day." Standing there holding the glitter-covered card with its wobbly letters spelling my name, I made a decision. This year, for the first time in my adult life, I would celebrate my birthday, not extravagantly but intentionally, with people who valued me not for what I achieved but simply for who I was. "I'm proud of the progress you're making," Dr. Sullivan told me when I shared this plan. "But remember that healing isn't just about creating new experiences. It's also about addressing the concrete ways your past has shaped your present, including financially." She was right. While therapy was helping me process the emotional impact of my discoveries, there was still the matter of the very real financial inequity that had occurred. The money that should have been shared equally between sisters had been disproportionately directed towards Stephanie, while the income from renting out the lake house during my birthdays had been channeled into investments that benefited my parents, not me. Healing my psychological wounds was vital, but so was addressing the tangible manifestations of my parents' choices. It was time to consider what justice might look like in this situation, not out of vengeance, but out of a need for concrete acknowledgement of the harm done. With this new clarity, I began researching my legal options, understanding that true healing would require both emotional processing and practical resolution. The path forward would involve not just internal work but external action, a reckoning not just with feelings but with facts, figures, and the financial reality of 26 years of calculated exclusion. Armed with new psychological insights and growing clarity about the extent of my parents' financial manipulation, I knew it was time to move beyond understanding to action. This wasn't about revenge or punishment, but about accountability and restoration, both emotional and financial. My first step was consulting with a lawyer. Through a professional connection, I was referred to Daniel Morgan, an attorney specializing in family financial disputes. I arrived at his downtown office with a meticulously organized folder of evidence, rental agreements, celebration expenditures, bank statements, and a detailed timeline of events. Daniel reviewed the documents thoughtfully before looking up. "This is a complex situation, Amber. Not just legally, but emotionally." "I understand that," I replied. "I'm not looking to destroy my family, but there needs to be acknowledgement and some form of restitution." "Let's start with what we know concretely," Daniel said, pulling out a legal pad. "The lake house rentals during your birthdays generated approximately how much over the years?" "At least $110,000, I answered. "Possibly more if there were cash payments not recorded." Daniel nodded, making notes. "And the differential spending between you and your sister for celebrations?" "Conservative estimate of $20,000 over the years. But there's something else I discovered recently that may be more significant." I explained my latest finding while organizing my father's office during his recovery. I had uncovered documents relating to a trust fund established by my grandfather. The trust had been intended to pay for higher education for both my sister and me with equal distributions. However, financial records showed that while Stephanie's portion had been preserved for her, my portion had been diverted into my parents' investment accounts years earlier. "They told me I was on my own for college," I explained to Daniel. "I worked multiple jobs, applied for every scholarship, graduated with honors, while Stephanie had her education fully funded. I never questioned it because I'd grown up hearing we couldn't afford things. It was just more of the same pattern. But the trust fund money was specifically designated for both of us." Daniel's expression grew more serious. "That changes things significantly. Misappropriation of trust fund money is a clear legal issue, not just a family dispute about birthday parties. Over the next several weeks, Daniel and I worked together to build a comprehensive case. We traced the movement of funds from the trust into my parents' personal accounts and subsequently into their investments. We documented the consistent pattern of financial discrimination between siblings. We created spreadsheets showing how the rental income from the lake house during my birthdays had been channeled into retirement accounts that benefited only my parents. Meanwhile, the family rift continued to deepen. My father had largely recovered physically but remained emotionally distant, communicating through terse notes left on the kitchen counter or messages relayed through my mother. Extended family members continued to take sides with holiday gatherings approaching and tensions mounting about who would attend which celebrations. In a surprising development, my mother asked to meet me privately one afternoon. We sat in a cafe downtown, away from my father's potential interruption. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began hesitantly. "About everything you've discovered, everything you've said. You're right, Amber. What we did was wrong, what I allowed to happen was wrong." I waited, unsure where she was going with this. "I want to help make it right," she continued, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "These are copies of financial documents your father doesn't know I have access to. Bank statements, investment reports, records of the trust fund transactions. I've been making copies for years just in case." In case of what I asked, stunned by this revelation. My mother looked down at her coffee. "In case I ever found the courage to leave. Or in case one of you girls needed to know the truth someday." The documents she provided filled critical gaps in our legal case, showing clear patterns of financial manipulation that extended beyond what I had initially discovered. The trust fund misappropriation was just the tip of the iceberg. There was evidence that my father had systematically directed family resources toward Stephanie and away from me, creating a significant financial disparity that had shaped both our lives and opportunities. With this new evidence in hand, Daniel advised that we had a strong case for legal action. However, he cautioned litigation between family members is always destructive. "Before filing anything, I suggest we approach your father with a settlement proposal, one that acknowledges the harm done and offers a path to resolution that doesn't involve public court proceedings." I agreed, and together we drafted a settlement agreement that included 1. Financial restitution for my portion of the misappropriated trust fund, with interest. 2. Compensation for the consistent pattern of unequal treatment, calculated based on documented expenditure differences. 3. A percentage of the rental income generated by the lake house during my birthday weeks. 4. A formal acknowledgement of the pattern of differential treatment. The total came to just over $200,000, a significant sum but one that accurately reflected 26 years of systematic financial discrimination. Before presenting this to my father, I met with Stephanie to ensure she understood and supported the approach. "This isn't about taking anything from you," I explained. "It's about addressing the inequality that neither of us created but both of us were affected by." Stephanie was fully supportive. "If anything, the amount seems low," she said after reviewing the figures. "I had no idea how much they spent on me compared to you. It's sickening, Amber. I feel guilty for every party, every celebration." "Don't," I told her firmly. "You were a child too. This was their decision, not yours." With Stephanie's backing, I arranged a formal meeting with both parents, Daniel, and a mediator. My father initially refused to attend, sending a dismissive note. Family matters should be handled within the family, not with lawyers present. It was my mother who finally convinced him, making it clear that she would attend with or without him, and that she was prepared to provide testimony about the financial decisions made over the years. Faced with this unprecedented rebellion from his usually compliant wife, my father reluctantly agreed to the meeting. The confrontation took place in Daniel's office, a neutral space with the formality needed to convey the seriousness of the situation. My father arrived with his own lawyer, a longtime friend who looked uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. As Daniel presented our case, methodically walking through the trust fund misappropriation, the birthday celebration, disparities, the lake house rental income, I watched my father's face. His expression shifted from dismissive to concerned as he realized the extent of the evidence we had gathered and the potential legal consequences if we pursued the case in court. When Daniel finished and presented our settlement proposal, my father's lawyer asked for time to consult privately. They left the room for nearly an hour, returning with a counteroffer that acknowledged most of our claims but disputed the amounts. "I never intended to cause harm," my father said stiffly, reading from notes prepared by his lawyer. "Financial decisions were made with the family's overall welfare in mind." "William," my mother interrupted, surprising everyone. "That's not true, and you know it. You treated Amber differently from the beginning because she wasn't the son you wanted." The financial decisions followed from that emotional reality, not the other way around. The room fell silent. My father stared at my mother, as if she had transformed into a stranger before his eyes. In many ways she was finally speaking her truth after decades of compliance. After several more hours of negotiation, we reached an agreement. My father would provide financial restitution close to our original request, though structured as a series of payments rather than a lump sum. More importantly, from my perspective, the agreement included a formal acknowledgement of the pattern of unequal treatment and its impact on me. As we all signed the final documents, I felt a complex mix of emotions: vindication, but also sadness that it had required legal intervention to achieve what should have been freely given recognition of my equal worth within my own family. The settlement wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a concrete step toward justice, both financial and emotional. With this formal acknowledgement in place, I could now focus on the more difficult work of deciding what relationship, if any, I wanted with my parents going forward, and how to use this resolution to create meaning beyond my personal healing. The settlement agreement was finalized in late November, just as the holiday season was approaching, a time that had always emphasized the disparities in our family. This year would be different. With the formal acknowledgement of past inequities and financial restitution underway, I faced a new challenge: deciding what to do with both the money and the knowledge I now possessed. After much reflection and several sessions with Dr. Sullivan, I made a decision about the financial settlement. I would use a portion to secure my own future investing in retirement accounts that had been neglected during years of student loan repayments. Another portion would go toward a down payment on a small home of my own, something tangible and permanent, a space where I could feel fully secure and valued. But the bulk of the settlement, nearly $150,000, I dedicated to establishing the Equal Worth Foundation, a scholarship fund for young people who had experienced emotional neglect or differential treatment within their families. The foundation would provide not just financial support for education, but also access to therapy and mentorship from adults who understood their experiences. "Are you sure you want to give away so much?" Stephanie asked when I shared my plans. "You earned that money through years of hurt." "I'm not giving it away," I replied. "I'm transforming it into something meaningful, something that might help other children avoid what I experienced or heal from it sooner than I did." The irony wasn't lost on me. My father's obsession with financial investment was being repurposed to invest in emotional healing for others. There was a certain poetic justice in that redirection. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents entered a new and complicated phase. My father, faced with undeniable evidence and legal consequences, had grudgingly acknowledged the pattern of behavior, but struggled to connect it to its emotional impact. He approached the situation as he did most business problems, as a matter to be resolved and moved past as efficiently as possible. "I've signed the agreement," he said during one tense dinner. "I'm meeting the financial obligations. What more do you want from me, Amber?" "Understanding," I replied simply. "Recognition that this was never about the money. It was about worth, about value, about being seen. He shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. I don't know how to give you that. I provided for this family. I built a successful business. I created financial security. For everyone except me, I pointed out quietly. You secured Stephanie's education while telling me I was on my own. You celebrated her while telling me celebration wasn't important. You invested in lake house rentals instead of investing in my sense of belonging in this family. My father fell silent, perhaps finally beginning to grasp the deeper implications of his choices. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough, but it was a start, a small crack in the defensive wall he'd maintained for decades. My mother's journey was different. Having finally spoken her truth during the settlement negotiations, she seemed to find new courage each day. She began seeing her own therapist, exploring the patterns in her marriage and her complicity in my father's treatment of me. In January, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She moved out of the family home and into a small apartment of her own. I'm not filing for divorce, she explained when I visited her new place. Not yet anyway. But I need space to figure out who I am apart from your father's expectations. I've been his echo for 35 years, Amber. I don't even know what my own voice sounds like anymore. Watching my mother discover her independence was both inspiring and bittersweet. I wondered how different all our lives might have been if she had found this courage when I was still a child. But regret served no purpose now. We were all moving forward as best we could, reconfiguring our relationships with new understanding. Stephanie and I grew closer through this process, our bond strengthened by honest conversation about the different experiences we'd had growing up in the same household. She struggled with guilt over the privileges she had unknowingly received at my expense, while I worked to reassure her that I didn't blame her for our parents' choices. I wish I had seen it, she said one evening as we shared a bottle of wine in my apartment. All those birthday parties, all those celebrations. I never questioned why you didn't have the same. We don't see what we're not taught to see, I replied. The important thing is that you see it now and you're standing with me as I try to heal from it. As my 33rd birthday approached in July, the first since discovering the truth about my childhood celebrations, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I would host my first real birthday party. Not an extravagant event, but a meaningful gathering of people who valued me for exactly who I was. I chose to hold it at the lake house, a deliberate reclaiming of a space that had been rented to strangers during my birthdays for decades. My father, still living there alone since my mother's departure, agreed to be away that weekend, a small concession that acknowledged my right to use the family property for my own celebration. The day of the party dawned warm and clear, the lake sparkling in the summer sunlight. Stephanie arrived early to help decorate hanging strings of lights across the deck and arranging wildflowers in mason jars. Friends arrived throughout the afternoon, Megan, with her daughter, colleagues from work, my therapist, Dr. Sullivan, even Thomas Bennett, who had provided such valuable context about my father's perspective. My mother came looking both nervous and determined, bearing a homemade cake, the kind she had never made for my childhood birthdays. Aunt Jessica brought photo albums from my early years, helping me reclaim and recontextualize memories that had been painful before. As evening fell and we gathered on the deck where so many other families had celebrated while I was excluded, Stephanie raised a glass. To Amber, she said, her voice catching slightly, who deserved celebration all along, and has finally claimed it for herself. The simple acknowledgement brought tears to my eyes as everyone echoed the toast. This was what I had needed all along, not extravagant parties or expensive gifts, but the fundamental recognition of my worth, my place, my right to take up space in the world and be celebrated for simply existing. Later that night, after most guests had departed, my mother and I stood at the edge of the dock looking out over the moonlit water. I should have done this for you every year, she said softly. I knew it was wrong, Amber. I just didn't have the courage to stand up to your father. I know, I replied, but we can't change the past. We can only acknowledge it and choose differently now. She nodded, wiping away tears. I'm trying to be braver now, for both of us. In the months that followed, the Equal Worth Foundation began its work identifying young people who needed both financial support and emotional validation. I shared my story publicly for the first time, speaking at a conference on family dynamics and psychological health. The response was overwhelming, countless people approaching me afterward to share similar experiences of differential treatment or emotional neglect. My father remained somewhat distant, still struggling to fully comprehend the emotional impact of his choices, but even he showed small signs of growth. He attended a family therapy session, sitting uncomfortably but attentively, as Dr. Sullivan explained the concept of emotional validation and its importance in child development. "I thought I was preparing you for a harsh world," he said afterward, the closest he had come to an apology. "I didn't realize I was making the world harsher for you." It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was an acknowledgement, and that was more than I had ever received from him before. The true measure of healing came the following summer, when my cousin David's daughter turned 8. He asked me to help plan her celebration, knowing my newfound passion for ensuring children felt valued and worthy of recognition. As I helped the little girl blow out her candles, watching her face light up with the simple joy of being celebrated, I felt something shift within me, a sense of reclaiming not just my own worth but my ability to ensure other children never questioned theirs. The cycle of neglect that had defined my childhood had been broken. In its place was growing a new pattern, one of acknowledgement, celebration, and the fundamental recognition that every person deserves to be seen and valued, not for their achievements or their gender or their ability to fulfill parental expectations, but simply for the miracle of their existence. My parents had always said they couldn't afford to celebrate me while they rented out our lavish lake house to strangers. The truth was that they couldn't afford not to, because the cost of that neglect was far greater than any rental income could justify. It had taken 32 years legal action and painful family confrontation to bring that truth to light. But in that light, healing had finally begun, not just for me but for our entire family. As I look toward the future now, I no longer measure my worth by achievements or others' validation. I know my value is inherent, not earned, and in that knowledge is a freedom my father's money could never buy, and a celebration more meaningful than any childhood party could have provided. So I ask you, have you ever felt overlooked or uncelebrated by those who should have valued you most? How did you reclaim your sense of worth? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories of healing and transformation. Remember, you are worthy of celebration, not for what you do, but for who you are. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may you always know your inherent value in this world.